is an absolute honour to introduce tonight's speaker. We always love welcoming authors that have strong Oxford connections. And Simon, obviously, has more than most. He's the grandson of J.R.R. Tolkien. He grew up in Oxfordshire and attended the college we're currently sitting underneath. He's the author of 5 novels, Orders from Berlin, The Inheritance, Final Witness, The King of Diamonds, and the book we're all very excited to hear about tonight, No Man's Land. No Man's Land is a powerful and moving picture of early 20th century England, torn apart by the First World War. It focuses on the life of Adam Raine as he makes his journey from boy to man, set against the backdrop of a society violently entering the world. The talk will last for around 40 minutes, after which there will be plenty of time for questions. I hope you enjoy the talk a lot. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Simon.
It's a really good thing, I think, to have this charity tonight, because one of the things I remember, reading about the First World War was the aftermath. And in the early 1920s, there were these soldiers, many of whom were sleeping under newspapers and selling matches on the streets of London. And also at night, if you went out into London in the small hours, there were all these people walking everywhere down the streets. They were the soldiers who had left their homes and couldn't stay in their homes anymore, just walking this slow, dark parade night after night. And so I think if there had been charities like this that had existed more in 1919, when these people came back from these unspeakable horrors, then that would have been a wonderful thing. But of course, as we know, back in those days, they understood a great deal less about PTSD. And that, as my book says, not all scars are visible. So, No Man's Land. First, it's a great pleasure and very strange to sit in Blackwell, of all places. My family has had a lot of connection with Blackwell over the years. My grandfather lived in the house that was built for Sir Basil Blackwell at 20 Northmore Road, and my aunt lived there for the first 17 years of her life, and that was the house in which he wrote The Hobbit and a great deal of the Lord of the Rings. And years later, I spent a great deal of my youth, misspent youth, both when I was at Trinity College and before, in Blackwell's, looking at books and buying books, because my father, who placed an enormous value on books, let me use his account within reason. I mean, I didn't break him, but I was able to buy a lot of books, some of which I still have, and always make me think of the great warren that was Blackwell's. And in those days, of course, in the Broad Street, Blackwell's was everywhere. There was Blackwell's Parkers, there was Blackwell's, the children's bookshop, and everywhere there was more. And I loved Blackwell's. This is the city of books, so I'm very inspired by that. World War I. When I was, I suppose, about 10 years old, I was given an LP record. I don't know if any of you know what LP is. It wasn't 78, but it was 33 1/3. And it was called 1914. And it was really good. It was one of those records that you could open out, and it was like had the newspapers of the time and everything, so you could really get into it. And they had these actors' voices pretending to be Sir Edward Grey. The lights are going out all over Europe, and it was like, wow. And there was shell fire of when the bombardment of Scarborough and Whitby took place, and it kind of took me. And so I listened to this record, and then when I walked up the town, because I lived in Watlington, some of you know Watlington, and I walked up the town, I looked at the War Memorial in kind of a different way, because on the War Memorial, there are so many names, and Watlington, particularly back then, it's kind of expanded since then, but it was such a small place. And there's one name that's called Harmon. There's 4 names from one family, 4 of them. Alfred, Bertie, Charles, Edwin. wiped out by this war between 1915 and 1917 in this tiny place. And places like Watlington, I remember being in Garsington with my friend Toby, and we went to see an old lady, and she had a photograph up on the mantelpiece. And they were her brothers, and they'd all gone too. I mean, this war just ate up these villages. And so I was very aware of that. And then later on, as I became a teenager, and we were all watching another war on the screens, we were watching Vietnam, and then I started to think about what it was like for these kids in America to be sent to this place and not have any choice about going there, about being drafted. And that made me think of the First World War too, about in the beginning in 1914 they went willingly, but by 1916 they'd introduced conscription because everybody knew, despite all the propaganda and everything else, what it was going to be like over there. So, you know, it was scary. So that kind of entered my mind. And then after I started becoming a writer, and Jay kindly mentioned in my other books, and I started with Final Witness and all the rest of it. Then I went to the battlefields with my friend Fiona over there, and my son, who was 15 at the time, and we were taken by the guide, and I guess, you know, for added effect, he dreamed this up. He took us to show us a couple of graves of people who were actually 15, you know, who'd gone to the enlistment office and said to the recruiting sergeant, "I'm 19. "No, you're not, mate." And so they go round the block 1 year, round the block another year, and then, you know, they're in the army. And so that was really took me. And there were several things on that trip that really stayed with me. There was one moment when my son, we'd gone in this sunken road from which they were going to, you know, charge on July the 1st. He found this piece of earthenware, and the guy who was guiding us round, he said, "This is from a rum jar." And he said, and often, you know, they were so scared at 0, or just before 0, that sometimes they were fighting over the rum jars, and the rum jars got broken on the floor. And this is kind of how I feel about history, which is why I write historical fiction, I guess, because I feel it's like there. We can't reach it, but it's like, sometimes it's like a really thin curtain. You can touch it, but just not quite. And so I felt that there. And then there was another place called the Sugar Factory, where you looked back from the sugar factory, and it was all kind of misty because it was December. And the guide said to us that when they come to this place, and the military policemen were ticking them off as they went up into the frontline trenches for July the 1st, that they had seen beside them people digging graves. Because the Chinese coolies were digging, and the pioneer battalions were digging graves as they went up. And we'll come on to that a little later, because really what I want to talk about tonight is July the 1st. But how terrible to pass your own graves, you know. They were told, of course, that they weren't passing their own graves, because it was all going to be fine, and we'll come on to that. But that kind of gave a lie to that. So, you know, that battlefield tour. And then I wanted to write a book about the First World War, but I kind of didn't feel ready, because this whole voyage of being a writer it takes a while. So I wrote thrillers. These are kind of, you know, plot-driven books. They're good, and like but they went back in time. And Orders from Berlin, which is my last one before this, that had a backstory into the First World War, and also it was about the Blitz. And I got this sense of this is maybe what I'm good at, and what I can do is recreate what it was like. And I guess that's what I want to do more than anything, is make people feel what it was like. So today I'm going to give a little bit of background. Some of you are going to know it, but what the hell? About 1916 and the 1st of July, and try and give you a sense of what it was actually like, because that's what I try and do. And if some of you ask you, I'm sure some of you are experts on the First World War, and you sit there and you ask me really detailed questions, I'm not necessarily going to go the answer, because I'm not exactly a historian. I'm a person who writes historical fiction, so that's kind of different. And what I try to do is to make people feel what it was like, and what it was like at that moment in July of 1916 is, to me, on that day, is probably the most important moment in the history of this country. Something that today, you know, 4 days ago was like up there with it. But that, to me, 1st of July 1916 is the day. And I'll come on at the end to try and explain why that is. So, no man's land. It's the story, as Jade said, about a boy who goes up to the north, and he comes out of London, he loses his parents, he's in the mines, or in the mining country, then he's adopted into a country house, and in none of these places does he feel at home. He's in a personal no man's land, until paradoxically he arrives in the trenches and he finds, through the comradeship with the people there, in no man's land, a home of sorts, but then that detaches him from the people he left behind, so that's why it's no man's land. But the real no man's land on the Somme in May of 1916 was an area of the Great Western Front that stretched from the Channel down to Switzerland, winding in this strange way, which was quiet. We all think of it as being this place that, erupted into this carnage and this hellfire, but in the run-up to July, it had become a quiet sector of the front, and troops who had gone through the hell up in Ypres and in Flanders were actually glad to go down to the Somme. It was kind of 15 miles long, the British sector. They'd taken it over from the French at the end of 1915. And there was generally a kind of live and let live. There was the morning hate, a phrase taken over later by George Orwell, in the morning when they would let loose before dawn, because dawn was the idea, was the time when you were supposedly going to be attacked, but there weren't too many attacks. And then they would cook their breakfast, and the enemy in the trenches on the other side, which was sometimes 100 yards away, sometimes 500 yards away, will cook their breakfast too. So you've got a really bizarre situation where you can actually smell your enemy's bacon frying, but you can't see him, because if you put your head up, you're dead, because the sniper's watching. But it's so strange that they were so close, and yet they couldn't see each other, not at least until July the 1st. So that's a first strange part of this this world. So I've got a pair of glasses. It's just a sense, a little bit of what it was like. And this is the hero, Adam, thinking about whether an attack ever would happen. Perhaps it would be tonight. The longer he gazed at the crooked fence pickets, the more they began to look like the silhouettes of a German patrol, crouching down on their knees, ready to rush forward. The empty bully beef tins tied to the wire were gently tinkling just as they always did. He knew it was the rats that were making the noise, but it was still hard to drive away the thought that he was listening to the sheaves of bayonets clinking. The increased intensity of his hearing, compensating for the reduction in his field of vision to 2 earth walls 7 feet apart, was a facet of trench life that Adam was only slowly getting used to. His sense of smell had, however, become blunted, a survival mechanism without which he wouldn't have been able to cope with the extraordinary stench of the front line, an amalgam of excrement, urine, cordite, chloride of lime, and putrefaction, which bore no relation to anything he had ever before experienced. So a little sense, perhaps, of what it was like in the run-up to the day. So, I think that's right. Snipers, watching on all sides, so you couldn't put your head up above the parapet at any time. And the snipers particularly focusing on the latrines, because that's where the flies were. So if you go to the latrine and you flew the flies away, then the sniper is actually going to know that there's somebody there, so he'll fire at the place. I mean, this is just a tiny example of the sheer bizarreness of this world of the front line. And that people, so many of the people in those trenches, that 15-mile stretch, in June of 1916, had never seen action. Some of them had been in Loos and Neuve-Chapelle in the terrible fighting in 1915. But a large majority of them, many of the actual regular army from 1914, the people who had participated in Mons and the Marne, had been killed. And so Kitchener had, as we know, raised this vast new army. And they were all in these trenches, in June of 1916, and they were the civilians. They weren't soldiers. They were the civilians who flocked to the recruiting stations, ready to fight for their king and country, eager to do it, and waiting for their opportunity. And that opportunity was just about to come. And the colonels were dugouts, some of them from the old, as they called them, some from the old Boer War, who had been brought in. And the colonels often loved these new army soldiers because they started off with their broom handles, as you know the stuff, broom handles with which they'd been drilling in Oxford and all the rest of it. But slowly, over time, over training, over 1914, 15 and 16, these battalions had turned into real fighting units, trained fighting units, which it had taken them, I don't know, nearly 2 years, 18 months to form, and which were, in some cases, going to take precisely 2 minutes to smash. So this is a strange thought about who these men were. They have often been described as the cream of England. They were the people, the brave, many of them educated, gone into the trenches to fight. But the problem is that the people in charge were not the new army. They were old army. And the staff, of which we start to hear a great deal more as the war goes on from the Somme, they didn't trust the new army. They didn't trust these civilians turned soldiers. And so when it came to the big plan for the big push that was going to occur in the summer of 1916, they were not going to allow these people to operate in the normal way. Normally, if you were going to charge an opposing trench, you rush from side to side. You move sideways, you rush, you do not walk across. And so there was an element of distrust as well that gave rise to this idea, which was behind the big plan for the big push on the 1st of July. And the idea was that everybody goes over in a series of waves, entering at one minute intervals. You go forward at a rate of about 100 yards every 2 minutes. No rushes, no sideways movement. The first wave consolidates the first German trench, then the second and the third waves go on to follow the other one. And in front of you is your artillery. But of course, the big problem is that if you get stopped, then the artillery goes rolling on ahead uselessly, and the people who the artillery was supposed to deal with come straight back up, and the artillery is completely useless because it's firing on ahead, and that's what happened in so many cases on the 1st of July. And not only were they not going to be allowed to rush, and they were not going to be allowed to move sideways, but also they were going to have to carry 70 pounds of equipment. Now, I'm sure all of you know this, but I mean, the detail of it is incredible. Rifle, bayonet, gas helmet, 200 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades to give to the trained bombers to throw, 2 empty sandbags, a spade, sometimes a pickaxe, wire cutters, flare, haversack, rations, mess tins, spare tires. I mean, everyone puts 70 pounds on your back. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's really heavy. I mean, it's really hard to walk fast, let alone to run. They couldn't run with that. And the people who actually got across to the other wire dropped their stuff. It was impossible. And behind them, the men coming in the rear waves, they actually had ladders and duck boards to be used for trench bridges, and rolls of barbed wire, bundles of stakes, and even some of them had carrier pigeons in baskets for the signals. The Germans thought, some of them, 1 or 2 Germans have left record that they thought they were bringing picnic baskets. Mad. So they trained exhaustively for this attack. I mean, this was so over-planned. This wasn't because they under-planned it, they over-planned it. And here's one of my guys, perhaps one of my favourite guys in the whole book, talking to the captain about what they're going to be doing after the training exercises. The troops were obedient but bemused by what they were being instructed to do. It was make-believe. It had to be. Everyone knew that standing up in no man's land, let alone walking across it, was as sure a way to commit suicide as putting a revolver to your head and pulling the trigger. And eventually Rawdon piped up and asked Captain Scarsdale what the point was of the exercise. "Why are we walking, sir?" he asked. "It don't make any sense. The Boche will be mowing us down like ripe corn with their machine guns if we don't rush them, and from closer up." "There won't be any Boche," said Seaton with a thin smile, or at least that's the idea. "Man, bosh," repeated Rawdon, scratching his head. "That don't make a whole lot of sense. Our guns are going to blow them to kingdom come, so all you're going to have to do is walk across and mop them up, just like what we're doing here." Rawdon still looked doubtful, but Seaton's bland expression discouraged further questions, and shaking his head, Rawdon went back to join in another attack. So that was what was going on behind the lines. And why did the staff believe that this was going to work? Well, because of the bombardment, because they fired over 1 million shells at the German lines, and they thought that 1 million shells would knock out the German, at least the German front line, including the machine gun emplacements. But they didn't. Part of it is also with the wire. They were firing shrapnel shells, which blow above the wire, and are supposed to disintegrate the wire. But they didn't. And many of the shells that were being fired actually turned out to be duds. And they had no conception, or appeared to have no conception, of what they were actually up against. Because the Germans had taken their dugouts and their trenches down 30 feet below ground level. And they had used concrete to revet it all round. And it is incredibly difficult to use 18-pound high explosive shells to do anything to that kind of defences. And the artillery failed to destroy the wire. One of the reasons, too, is that there was no surprise, because the British had been preparing for this for months, and the Germans knew what was coming. The Germans had attacked the French further down the front at Verdun, which was a terrible battle, just as bad as the Somme. And so they knew that the British were going to have to attack there in order to relieve the French. So the bombardment, it was essential they knock out the machine guns and the German batteries, but particularly the machine guns. It's really difficult to imagine what a machine gun can do. It was actually made by an American called Maxim, but the Germans knew about machine guns before the Great War, and they invested far more than the British in Maxim Spandau machine guns. They fire 500 rounds a minute. I mean, can you imagine a gun that can fire that? So, I mean, it's unbelievable. So it's right like having the power of 100 rifles, and they can fire over nearly a 2-mile range. I mean, if they weren't going to knock out the machine guns, they were in really big trouble, and the machine guns were also in concrete emplacements. Really strong concrete defences. So they went on for a whole week, and as we all know, the weather was just awful. It was like what we have outside. It was British weather, even though it was the middle of June in France. They had it in 1916. And this meant that the aeroplanes, which were really important in the First War, in the Second World War for bombing, but this was for actual observation, so that you could see what was going on. They couldn't verify what was happening underneath. What they did do is they sent some people across no man's land in the night for raids to see what was going on. But some of them heard singing. Some of them heard things coming out of the German dugouts. But the staff, who had spent so long making this plan, they heard what they wanted to hear, and they disregarded the rest. They become absorbed by the plan, and they started making further errors. It was classic attack philosophy in the British Army to attack at dark or at dawn. They were told to attack at 7:30, which is 3 hours after dawn, in full light, so that their artillery would have better observation. And their miners, the British mining battalions, had created these huge mines underneath the German trenches. But they let them off, not at 0 hour, but in the case of the Hawthorne mine, 10 minutes before 0 hour, in the others 2 minutes, which gave the Germans warning. So, the defences weren't destroyed, it was light, the Germans came back up, and their machine guns, which had already, you register a machine gun. You actually can register exactly where it's going to fire before the thing started. They simply had to sit behind it and they started. Because the British, in their wisdom, had cut funnels with white tape through their own wire, which the people in the front line were going to have to come through. They hadn't just cut all their wire. So as they came through the funnels, the German machine guns were already actually pointed down those funnels. So they become like killing corridors through the wire. So it's horrific. And there's been all this writing, historical writing since, about how, and some of it right, about how there was no possibility other than a war of attrition. There's been revisions since Oh, What a Lovely War. But the central, terrible mistakes, the 1st of July, are true. And they were there. And this is what happened. And so, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, what was it like? Well, the bombardment was a noise that some of the troops described like 100 trains going over the top of your head all at once. A hurricane of hoarse and hollow banging, piercing and beast-like screams. The troops going up into the front lines heard speeches from generals, and you've heard what the staff was saying, bawling at them through megaphones over the sound of the bombardment. You'll be able to go over the top with a walking stick. Not a rat can have survived this. You'll meet nothing but dead and wounded. And sometimes in the shadows they saw cavalry. And that gave them a lot of hope, because the cavalry had never been involved. And if they got breakthrough, the cavalry, which had been kept out in France, would be able to get through. Field kitchens came, gave them hot tea, and the horse-drawn wagons then withdrew, and the men obviously thought, I wish we were going back with them, because some of them suspected, seeing the graves being dug, that it wasn't going to be quite as they were being told. And they go into the communication trenches, and the communication trenches are very, very long. So you have to go up them, and many of them were going up them in the dark. And because of the bad weather, it's very, very muddy. Communication trenches are full of telephone wire, which is hanging off the side, and has some of it come unstuck, so they're constantly tripping. And remember, as I said, they've got 70 pounds of equipment on their back, so they're constantly falling, and they're in the dark, and they're holding on to the shoulders of the man in front. So each time they all go over. So they're screaming and they're shouting, and they pass the gunners who are up above the communication trenches, who've been firing for like a week, and they're stripped to the waist, and their eyes are bloodshot, and some are bleeding from the ears, because that's what happens if you fire guns for like over 6 days. So they get up into the trenches, and now, because they've postponed the attack by 2 days, because of the bad weather, the frontline trenches are incredibly crowded, and in the period, the last night before 0, they are so crowded that you can't actually lie down. In some cases you can't sit down at all, because you are so cramped together. Out beyond the trench in no man's land is an area that is still full of flowers and grass, and there are hares and creatures out there, because this hasn't been a battlefield up to now. 4 o'clock in the morning, dawn. They can begin to see the German lines through the box periscopes. There's a little light rain. They catch some of it in their helmets so that they can have a drink. It doesn't last that long. And soon the sun comes out, and all the rain has stopped, and it's a perfect, beautiful summer morning. They can start to feel the sun on the nape of their necks. Some of them get breakfast, but because of what I've described about the communication trenches, it was a mess. Some of them got it, some of them didn't. Some of them got rum, some didn't, like the rum jar that I saw, when I was there in 2006. And so time passes. Some of them get drunk, some of them get scared, but they're crowded together, and the one thing you can't do in the crowd is admit to being frightened. So you have this strange sense that you're all together, but you're also isolated, because you can't admit the fear. So they start making jokes. A lot of them are smoking. Some of them are writing letters if they've got space to write letters. There's pages in their pay books in which you can make wills. They're thinking maybe about what's happening in England at just that time. This is when the cows come out. A lot of them are coming from agricultural areas. Some of them are speaking softly to each other. A lot of them have like lucky charms which came back with the bodies. White heather, shamrock, a picture, lock of hair, a rosary. Now at the hour of our death, all this. Some of them, even, we're told, started turning out their pockets because they got pictures of naked French girls in them that they didn't want to go home with their bodies. So a lot of people thinking in different ways. Some want to get it over as the seconds go down. Some want every second of their life to last. Because it could be clear to them that it is not quite as they thought. Because the Germans are starting to respond. The shell fire coming from the German side into them. As the shells arrive into the trenches, they start throwing them back over what's called the parados, which is the back side of the trenches. So it gets a little bit less crowded. So they know that all the German shells haven't been silenced. It hasn't worked. The mines go up. And the sound of the bombardment now is that if you want to say anything to anybody next door to you, they're not going to hear. Because even if you screamed at the top of your voice, you're not going to hear anything, because it is built to this hurricane bombardment at the very end. But then, at 7:30, it stops. Because in order for the artillery to go on to the next area, assuming, of course, that the front line has now been smashed, they have to re-register. And there is a moment of silence. And in the silence, you can hear the larks. The sun's out. It's just like it would have been in England. So there's this moment where these people have been told that they are going to walk over, that the war is going to go over, they're going to break through the Germans, they're going to win the war. There is a moment before that terrible disillusionment, the terrible massacre begins, the worst day of the British Army in its history. There is this moment, this second of silence. I think, as I say, that it is the most significant moment of all, perhaps, in the history of this country. And the officers are there with their whistles. They look at their watches. The men have fixed their bayonets. The sun is glittering on the metal. And they go over. And the machine guns, which, as I've said, have already registered on them, start to spray. Tack, 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 tack. And it's scything the men down. It's like heavy rain on a bright summer's day. And the shrapnel shells are falling. It is like going into complete, total heavy fire. And the bullets are ripping through the grassy slopes up which they're coming. So the smell is the smell of fresh cut grass. Just like you would on an English summer's day. Mown grass. And the front line lay down. It's like in that Pink Floyd song, The Dark Side of the Moon. The front line go down. And the people behind think, they must have had different orders. It must have been, not we're walking across, but we're supposed to go across to go down, because then we're going to go down, and go on our stomachs like we do on the race. But it was because they were all dead. Incredible noise. And the barrage has lifted away off the German lines. So the Germans are just standing at the top of their trenches with these machine guns, with, the power that I've described. Some of them get across. But when they get across, they are enmeshed on the wire, because the German wire, which is now incredibly strong because the Germans have time to prepare, they're caught on it, because the wire has not been destroyed by the shrapnel shells. And those that are coming behind, the German barrage now moves off the front British line, moves back to stop people, and I think many people know about the Newfoundland Regiment, which as it came up, because the communication trenches were so congested, they come up over the top and were completely wiped out by the German barrage going behind. Some, of course, some of the commanders had thought about this, and they thought this isn't right. And this is actually what happens in my book, is that some of them had gone out through what are called saps into no man's land, and they'd rushed the German wire. And some of them had cut the German wire before, so they were able to get into German trenches where they have hand-to-hand fighting. And that's really what happens in my book. But terrible hand-to-hand fighting with these hand grenade Mills bombs and flamethrowers, and horrible. But they're completely cut off from the people behind them, because nobody can get across no man's land, on which is a constant fire. So once they're in these opposing trenches, they reverse the parapet because they're expecting German counterattack, and they put up the bodies of the dead Germans and their own dead onto the new parapet at the back, what had been the parados of the German trench, and the blood's coming back on them. And they wait, because they're cut off from the back, and the only chance they have is to wait for night. And I just want to read a bit from here, which is a description of a German counterattack on such a trench. Remember, of course, that the number of people who had actually got into the German trenches on the 1st of July in the area we're talking about, in the northern part of the sector, was very, very small. All along the trench, the exhausted survivors stared out through box periscopes or across barricades as they counted down the hours and minutes to the end of the day. Slowly, infinitely slowly, the sun descended towards the British line, throwing out a blaze of blood, red and gold glory as it set, so that's behind them. As one, they willed it to sink, but their shout of joy when its disk finally disappeared below the horizon was premature. The Germans had also been waiting for dusk, and as the twilight deepened, they attacked again. This time, however, they came across the open land that divided the front-line trench, that's the German front-line trench, from their second line behind. The British bombardment had pitted the ground between with shell holes, and the grey soldiers came on in short rushes, leaping from one crater to the next. Up on the parapet, behind his improvised cover of sandbags, Sergeant Harris swung the Lewis gun from side to side, spraying bullets. The Lewis gun is a light machine gun. Swung the Lewis gun from side to side, spraying bullets in a continuous arc that held the attackers at bay. Tack, 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 tack. The chatter of the gun was the platoon's heartbeat. It was keeping them alive. But then inevitably it jammed. The men could hear the mechanism catching uselessly as the loader, a young, nervous-looking corporal called Bennett, tried in vain to reposition the belt, which kept slipping through his sweating hands, and the noise felt like a death rattle in their throats. "Bring it down," Seaton, the captain, ordered, and as he and Bennett examined the gun on the floor of the trench by the light of an electric torch, the others stood on the parapet among the corpses that they had hoisted up there at the beginning of the day, and threw the German stick grenades. The German had grenades were on sticks, which made them slightly different, and they were easier to throw, actually, that they had brought up from the dugout, until their arms were so sore that they could hardly lift the bombs above their heads and had to toss them out underhand. The attackers were close now, and there was no wire to protect the trench, and they were responding in kind. Bombs came hurtling through the air, and several of the defenders fell back into the trench, mortally wounded. But the defenders' tactics were working, judging from the guttural cries and shouts out beyond the parapet. Some of the bombs were finding their target, and the red flashes of the explosions lit up the Germans' retreating figures in silhouette as they withdrew beyond the range of the grenades. But they had not given up. It was as if they knew that the supply of bombs would soon be exhausted, and that the Tommies would then be at their mercy, unless the Lewis gun could be prepared. Seaton knew that everything turned on that. He could feel the belt was wet. That had to be the problem. Bennett pulled it out and pushed a new one into the feed block and held it up for Sergeant Harris to take. But the sergeant didn't respond. Perhaps he couldn't hear. Bennett reached up and tapped him on the shoulder to get his attention, but the sergeant didn't turn. He just fell back from his sandbag emplacement, landing with a thud at their feet. There was a small, neat hole in the centre of his forehead, and a larger, scruffier one at the back of his head where the rifle bullet had exited after blasting through his brain. Bennett's teeth were chattering, and the Lewis gun was shaking in his hands. It was a miracle he hadn't dropped it on the ground. Seaton went up close to him and held his shoulders, looking hard into his eyes. "This is your moment, Corporal. This is what you've trained for. You can do this. I know you can," he said, and his voice was clear and calm amidst the maelstrom. Up above, there were almost no grenades left, and the Germans had resumed their advance. Soon they would be in the trench. Bennett swallowed and nodded. Gripping the ladder, he climbed up into the sergeant's sandbag emplacement and took the gun from Seaton's upstretched hands. He set it in place and immediately began firing. The new belt ran freely through the block, and the bullets flew out, mowing down the enemy just as they reached the trench. It was enough. The Germans had no answer to the machine gun's deadly fire, and those that remained crept away into the dusk, and the attack was over. And so they were able, as darkness came, some of them, to retreat back across no man's land. And no man's land was a truly appalling place by now. The wounded who'd been sheltering out there, those of them were left, many of them had died during the day, in the new shell holes, taking cover behind the dead who they were using like sandbags, some of them their comrades. And unlike the previous days, where there had been water from the sky, there was no water, and they were appalling thirst. And if you're losing blood, the thing you have to have is water, and they couldn't get any water. The other terrible thing is that they had triangles, metal triangles, put on their backs so that the aircraft and the observation could see where they had got to on the day, each division. But the flashes on their back in the high sunlight gave away their position to the snipers from the German trenches. Also, they'd been told to put upturned rifles as they went across no man's land beside the wounded, and the Germans knew this, and so they fired at bodies that were lying, if they moved, that were beside upturned rifles. And this is a much shorter description, as they are coming back across no man's land, of what it was like. Here's two of them, Adam and his friend Rawdon, who were capturing the mortally wounded, or perhaps mortally wounded captain, who they're carrying between them. Here and there, as they passed, they could see the grotesque remains of their comrades silhouetted in the moonlight, hanging on the barbs of the German wire, riddled with bullets. They weren't human anymore, rather they seemed like the straw guys dressed in throwaway clothes that Adam remembered the neighbourhood children wheeling through the gaslit Islington streets in half-broken perambulators on Guy Fawkes nights when he was a boy. Adam and Rawdon moved slowly out into no man's land, picking their way carefully through the shell holes as they went down the slope towards the white chalk line of the sunken path from which they'd attacked earlier. Seaton groaned as they went, but otherwise said nothing. It was a terrible place. They had to watch each step they took to avoid tripping in the muddy shell holes or stepping on the wounded or the dead, and it was worse, much worse, once they reached the path and began to go up again towards the British line. Bodies were everywhere, and rats too, screaming as they approached. They felt hands groping weakly at their puttees, and demented voices calling out pitifully for help or for water or for their mothers. Such a strange cry, Adam thought, in this blighted landscape where no woman had ever been. The moaning and the howling and the groaning and the crying synthesized in their ears into one single unearthly wail. This was Golgotha, the hill of the skull, the field of bones at the end of the world. I think that was what no man's land was like on the night of July the 1st, as they went back. So, all that was meant to be a bit on what it was like. And I think that it's very important 100 years later for British people to have some sense of what it was like for these men who went out. And what did it mean? What did this mean? It was a vast change in the way in which people fought. First the soldiers, but then it went out into the population. Why it was a disillusionment? Why not already a disillusionment? There had been terrible battles at Lewes, where gas had first been used in 1915. Because, as I've said, the new army, this new army of civilians, was seeing battle for the first time, many of them. Because of the promises they'd been made, because they believed the promises, partly because of the incredibly long bombardment. And it was a disillusionment because of the incredible casualties that followed that day. Nearly 20,000 dead in no man's land on that day. And also because of what followed. The terrible war of attrition that the Somme became until it petered out in mud because they could go no further in the November mud. And they had made only a 7-mile advance with no breakthrough. What it meant was a loss of youth, a loss of vitality. These people would describe themselves as dried up by the end of the Somme. Trees without sap, their will destroyed by constant shell fire, inhuman conditions, constant fear of death and the death of their comrades. And very shortly, they became old. The young became old in France in 1916. And these were the men who were joined up in 1914, who we see those old film of rushing to the colours, queuing up in the streets to join the colours, told that the war would be over by Christmas, which would have been a disaster because we wouldn't be able to get there in time to see it. A great disillusionment. And what did that disillusionment emanate into? It started in 1914, and I'm sure many of you know this poem. Only a little bit of it is perhaps you. This is Rupert Brooke, 1914, the sonnet piece. Now God be thanked who has matched us with this hour, and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye and sharpened power to turn as, and this is really important, as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary. swimmers into cleanness leaping. By the end of the psalm, it was a mud bath of blood and horror, unspeakable. And it was a charnel house by the end of the psalm. It was a land in which God could not be, at least for those of the time. In my book, there is a parson. They were very brave, the chaplains who went out. And my chaplain was finished by the war, really. And this is about the chaplain. Adam remembered the parson talking in the YMCA canteen about his divine mission to minister to the men. But now, this is late on in the psalm, he seemed to have abandoned that vocation to focus on the dead instead. Perhaps it had just got too hard to keep telling soldiers living in terror and misery that God loved them, whereas the dead asked no questions. And this is a picture of the parson out in no man's land with Adam. This is later, maybe September. Lying flat on the torn-up ground at the lip of a shell hole, holding out the cross around his neck above the mangled remains of a soldier, looking like a scarecrow in his filthy surplice, he would shout out the words of committal. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ, so loudly and fervently that for a moment Adam almost believed in them too. Sometimes resurrection arrived quicker than anticipated, when a shell came crashing down, blasting the newly buried corpse back out of his grave. But the parson paid no heed to this. He took care never to look back over his shoulder, as he knew that that was where doubt was waiting. And every day his wide-open blue eyes, obsessively seeking out the next corpse, seemed to Adam to have become more fixed and staring than the day before. The smell of the bodies was appalling, a foul, sweet stink of putrefaction that rose up in nauseous waves as soon as they were moved. Soon the soldiers took to wearing gas masks as they worked, but the parson to refuse to wear even a handkerchief over his face. God needed to hear his prayers as he sent the dead to Jesus. And the great symbol of this world was the statue of the Virgin, which I don't know if any of you knew about, on the church at Albert. And Albert was the centre of behind the line, behind this sector of the line. It was a basilica that had been built in about the 1890s, and a shell had come down and gone into the statue so that it had keeled over. But many people said that if the statue falls to the ground, the Germans will win the war. So the British and French engineers had gone in and with hawsers had put the Virgin in place so that she hung at 90 degrees, holding Jesus, the baby, over the ground underneath. And the soldiers, as they went up to the line and came back, passed under the Virgin. And this is a reaction of Rawdon to it later in the war. And a sense, perhaps, of the bitterness. So what do you make of her? Rawdon asked Adam. I think she's sorrowing, lamenting the folly of men, said Adam, staring up into the Virgin's sad face. Aye, she's sorrowing all right, said Rawdon, nodding. But I reckon she's feeling a bit more than that. I think she's had enough of the whole fucking show and she's getting ready to throw baby Jesus down on the cobblestones. Splat. And then she can follow. Adam looked over at his friend and saw that he was quite serious. Yes, he said, looking back over the statue, I see exactly what you mean. Because if you lived through that and you saw all that, how could you continue to believe? And I think that we moved from the Victorian world in which there was a God and a benevolent God into one where God appeared to have, at least for that time, disappeared. It was a loss of belief for the men in charge. The Prince of Wales was very popular, even though he came to with Wallace Simpson later, because he came up into the front line so much, but the staff never came. They were seen always as going back, speeding back in their cars to lighted chateaux. This is, again, a short, not very long quote from what Rawdon, again, one of my favourite characters, says about the staff. Stories abounded of how out of touch they were. According to Rawdon, who had it on good authority from a corporal he'd met on fatigue duty, one staff captain had gone up to the front line, looked out over the parapet and exclaimed, "Good God, I didn't know we were using colonial troops." Rawdon was a good mimic and gave a perfect imitation of the officer's strangled upper-class voice before reverting back to his own North Country dialect. So he wanders off, poking the duckboards with his swagger stick like he owns the place, and the sentries are laughing at him behind his back, laughing fit to burst. Ain't the bastard seen a dead man afore, they go, because the poor bugger's turned black in the sun, of course. Black as the ace of spades. This was a different world. This was a whole new world that came into being on the Somme. And it gave its voice to people like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen, and we all know Dulce Decorum Est. I'm not going to read you that. It was a new way of seeing things. It was a change of eras. It was an idealism replaced by cynicism. The world changed. Before 1914, the Victorians, or many of them, had believed in progress, and the technology that was bringing that progress appeared to them benevolent, even as its pace increased. It brought them the motor car from the 1890s. It brought them the cinema. It brought them the telephone and the aeroplane. Everything was changing. It was God's dispensation that was bringing this. A Frenchman flew across the channel, but it was also bringing the Maxim gun and the high explosive shell, and it was bringing murder, and it was bringing the world of machines. And I think that's what my grandfather wrote about in The Lord of the Rings, because he was obviously influenced about this. He brought a world of metal and machines, which is how Faramir described Saruman in the Lord of the Rings. A new, terrible world. It ushered in the terrible world of the 20th century. And the swimmers into cleanness leaping drowned in the Somme and Passchendaele. And the people that survived the war into the 20s and the 30s, they couldn't think like those young men who had queued up at the recruiting offices in 1914, because everything had changed. And I want to finish, I don't know how long I've got on, probably waiting on 45 minutes instead of 40, but you just allow me, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, just to finish with this. And it's not my words, it's the words of a man I greatly admire, who was the librarian at Hull University. And he wrote this in 1964, and it's a poem, and it's called 1914. Those long, uneven lines, standing as patiently as if they were stretched outside the Oval or Villa Park. The crowns of hats, the sun on moustached, archaic faces, gazing as if it were all an August bank holiday long, and the shut shops, the bleached established names on the sunblinds, the farthings and sovereigns and dark-clothed children at play, called after kings and queens, the tin advertisements for cocoa and twist, and the pubs wide open all day, and the countryside not caring, the place names all hazed over with flowering grasses, and fields shadowing doomsday lines, and a wheat's restless silence, the differently dressed servants with tiny rooms and huge houses, the dust behind windows. Never such innocence, never before or since, has changed itself to past without a word. The men leaving the gardens tidy, the thousands of marriages lasting a little while longer. Never such innocence again. And that's what I think changed at the Somme. So thank you very much.